I propose we start. Welcome everyone to this first Water Talk of the new term. My name is Roy Brouwer. I'm the Executive Director of the Water Institute, organizing the Water Talks. We're very happy to have you back with us in this new academic year. Before I start introducing the speaker, I just want to acknowledge the land on which we are located. You can see this in this slide. We're on the land that was part of the Haldimand Tract, promised to the Six Nations, the Haudenosaunee peoples, a long time ago. And here in green, you see the land that was originally promised to the Haudenosaunee peoples. And in brown, you see the reserve on which they are currently located. So around 5% of the land that was originally promised to the Haudenosaunee peoples is actually currently the reserve on which they reside nowadays. I encourage you to acknowledge the land where you are. If you're interested, here is a link to a website that we consult here in the Water Institute where you can find more information about the land acknowledgements. So having said that, I'm going to move to the introduction of the speaker. If you have any questions during the talk, please use the Q&A box, and then myself and my colleague Nancy Goucher will get to this when the talk is over. So please don't use the chat box, but use the Q&A box, and also note that the talk will be recorded and we will share that on our YouTube channel soon after. So let me start introducing the speaker. I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to look at my text for the introduction. So we're very happy to have Professor Bryan Brooks kick off the Water Institute Water Talks today. Professor Brooks is a distinguished professor in the Department of Environmental Science and the Institute of Biomedical Studies, and he's the Director of Environmental Health Science at Baylor University Waco in Texas in the US. His research focuses on water quality. He develops approaches to define and manage chemical hazards and risks, focusing on environmental, aquatic, and comparative toxicology and pharmacology, bioaccumulation, sustainable molecular design and green chemistry, and the ecology and toxicology of harmful algae blooms. Professor Brooks is a fellow of the Society of Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry and the Royal Society of Chemistry. He's also well known because he's the editor-in-chief of Environmental Science and Technology Letters. He received many awards. I have a long list here. I'm just going to mention a few of them. He received the Kanega Award from the Society of Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry, which is a leadership award from the Water Environment Federation. He received 2 scientific and technological achievement awards from the US EPA, and he's a recipient of the Resi-Farm International Environmental Award. His work is all over the world, as is evidenced by his many visiting research chairs. Again, a long list of the different places where Professor Brooks has worked. I'm just going to mention the most recent ones. He serves as the Pearl River Scholar Chair Professor at the Guangdong Key Laboratory of Environmental Pollution and Health in China, and the School of Environment at Yinnan University in Guangzhou. Professor Brooks, we're honored to have you with us today. I'm happy to share the virtual floor with you.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to share some ideas with you today. I wish I was there with you in person. I'm sure that you all are looking forward to opportunities to engage. Yeah, I will promote, I guess, ACS publications, and one of my roles as editor of ES&T Letters. And of course, we would welcome your very best work at Letters ES&T. And also the ES&T family has 2 new journals, ACS ES&T Water and ACS ES&T Engineering, that have been publishing over the last year. So what I'm going to do is really think a bit about, I'll talk a little bit about my own work, but really, how do we identify what our priority research needs, and how can we actually identify opportunities to be more strategic, to be more efficient, and address some of the big challenges that are facing us. We all have an understanding of the Sustainable Development Goals. These are really noble goals, in my opinion, and all nations have agreed that we need to move toward these goals. They're obviously not standalone. We must be able to think about the interconnections. And I think this is oftentimes a guiding North Star, perhaps, for us. They are fairly general, so we do have to think about some of the specific activities and opportunities to really advance toward achieving and realizing the SDGs for all people in an equitable way. At the same time, we think about the connections among the goals, things like the food, energy, water nexus is a global megatrend. This has been realized for a number of years now. A lot of research is going on, and just illustrates the interdependence and the importance of water. So again, very, very happy to be with you here for the first Water Talk at the start of your term. At the same time, we have a recognition of these important goals and maybe aspirational areas to move toward. We have great challenges. We know that pollution is at the global level a great and a growing problem. Just the implications for health outcomes in low and middle income countries are sobering, as recently contributed by Phil Landrigan and colleagues through the Lancet Commission, Pollution and Health. Some of your Canadian colleagues there, Neil Basu and McGill was involved with this. We also have major challenges from biodiversity and ecosystem services perspectives. The relatively recent IPBES report pronounced that biodiversity is declining faster right now than any other time in human history. So with these challenges, but also these wonderful opportunities in mind, we were interested in trying to adopt a big questions model. Perhaps you've seen this used before in conservation biology or other disciplines. In fact, one of our first activities in this space was held in Canada and largely supported by Health Canada and Environment and Climate Change Canada. In fact, this was about 10 years ago, a wonderful workshop in Niagara-on-the-Lake, and resulted in an identification following survey techniques of the broader community of really some key research needs for pharmaceuticals and personal care products in the environment. Now that manuscript is actually upon the 10-year anniversary. It's really helped develop strategic research trajectories for multiple disciplines related to these types of contaminants. And we saw the value proposition of essentially thinking more broadly than just groups of contaminants. Let's think across these multidisciplinary fields to just say, hey, if we could engage people that are doing the work. So this isn't Brian's idea, perhaps, or Roy's idea. It's our collective ideas that may help us advance toward achieving more sustainable environmental quality. We partnered with the Society of Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry, and also in North America with the ACS Environmental Chemistry and Agrochemicals divisions. The key is this was a global exercise, so very unique in this regards, but it was transparent. It was bottom up. It was inclusive. It included multiple disciplines, and it also included multi-stakeholders from different sectors. So after we asked thousands of people around the world to submit their research ideas, we then held synthesis workshops that I was fortunate to facilitate in these locations. And those workshops were tri-chaired by regional experts from academia, government, and business. And again, the participants were representing work going on in that region. Now, in all told, there were 149 research questions identified through this Global Horizon Scanning project. And, if you're a graduate student or early career professional, I think this is a very useful reading. What we've already found is that the questions have been selected by government agencies, by NGOs in various locations around the world, and they've been selected for strategic funding. Also is really useful reading for early career professionals because, hey, maybe it's not going to cover a topic that's very interesting to you, but it is also an opportunity to think across the landscape, across disciplines, how various sectors and disciplines around the world are identifying key research needs. There's some common themes if we look across the different workshops that were performed and some of the questions that emerge. The megatrends in environmental quality. How is urbanization impacting ecological and human exposure to and release of contaminants? The reality is you guys know these numbers. I mean, we're concentrating people in cities unlike any other time in human history. We're concentrating the consumption of resources like food, energy, and water. That creates tremendous opportunities to be more intentional, to actually be more efficient, to think about resource recovery, right? But at the same time, we're also concentrating chemical usage. And so the waste streams, unfortunately, in so many places, including many of the mega cities that are emerging around the world, are not managed as you may see there where you live in Southern Ontario. Think about some of the work that we've done in Hong Kong. On the left, we look at essentially sewer sheds that we've studied. And this is on Hong Kong Island, looking to the north across Victoria Harbor. And this is the harbor area treatment scheme. And so we examined different sewer sheds within that region. And then on the right is the Wint landfill. This is one of the largest municipal landfills that we're aware of, and it's active in Asia. And you can see essentially the view along the coastline where the solid waste is coming in on barges. Okay, so they're barging solid waste around Hong Kong into the Wint landfill, which is basically located on the basically the north and west side, essentially, of Hong Kong there, if you're familiar with the area. And then I've just turned around, I've taken a picture of the landfill looking back to essentially to the east. And you can see that there's liners that are present in Hong Kong. So pretty developed facilities and capacities, maybe not the same as some of the other places that we've worked, where landfills are not really engineered and don't have liners, and you have to be concerned about seepage into groundwater and resulting exposures to people and the natural world. So again, here's this port, and you can see that they're bringing in essentially solid waste into the landfill. They do capture, okay, the leachate from the landfill. It goes through a wastewater treatment plant. This is a picture of that wastewater treatment plant. The building in the background is actually where the sludge is being burned. But then after the leachate leaves this wastewater treatment plant, it's discharged basically right into the coastline. Not sure if you've worked with landfill leachate before. But this was the first effluent that I had worked with that was being discharged to a surface water that created problems for a graduate student working with me. In fact, the sample almost like gelatinized in just 15 minutes, so she couldn't even finish her first filtration extraction step. We had to rethink our approach. So that's being discharged to the coastline, and what's in that landfill leachate, and also the leachate of closed landfills. We also were able to sample leachate coming from landfills that hadn't been used for about a decade, and also others that hadn't been used for about 2 decades. And we're still seeing antibiotics being discharged from these landfills, and in some cases, fairly common antibiotics, including ones listed on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines that are exceeding water concentrations that are of concern for the development of antibiotic resistance. This is also a key question that comes up in various locations. Again, basically a One Health type of a question, these inherent intersections between human health and the environment. And so if we were to just look at it's a project with one of the former Brazilian students that work with us, Bruno Schaffhauser, and we see that just for erythromycin, one of those compounds we saw in Hong Kong exceeding these predicted no effect concentrations that essentially are using like a minimal selective concentration, okay? That if you are below this level, then the concentration of the antibiotic is is perhaps below a level that would promote the development of antibiotic-resistant microorganisms. And we see, of course, just this antibiotic-resistant PNEC value for erythromycin, based upon the work that he did a few years ago, was being exceeded 33% of the time in Asia, but also quite often in North America and Europe. Ciprofloxacin, again, one of these essential medicines for the World Health Organization. If we look at the effluent discharges around the world for Cipro, 58% of municipal effluents are exceeding that value. This is a really fascinating space, and we're working with a colleague, environmental engineer in North Carolina, Jacqueline Rice-Baku, that's done some really nice work with the student, Sarah, on looking at the United States. And we've been identifying hotspots, basically. Sarah has done incredible work, and hope to be able to share that with you soon. Let's go back to Hong Kong for a second. Again, this is a dock, right? This is where they're bringing in the hazard or the solid waste. And so it was kind of a bit of a cloudy day. And I asked, hey, what are all the things floating out there? And of course, he said, oh, Professor Brooks, this is where we're growing our oysters. So there's an oyster operation there. And of course, this is where they're discharging that wastewater from the wastewater treatment plant. And keep in mind, this is Hong Kong. So the much greater capacity than some of the other places that we've worked around the world. This is an engineered wastewater treatment plant. This is an engineered landfill with liners that they're actually capturing the leachate and trying to achieve some discharge. But yes, there are different types of contaminants that are accumulating in these organisms. And the good news is for a lot of the substances that we're aware of, the levels are below what we might consider of concern for human health consumption. And we do also see a number of substances that accumulate in these bivalves for substances of concern, getting a lot of attention. And unfortunately, those substances oftentimes don't have enough toxicological data to establish some of the screen level risk assessment metrics. We think about just aquaculture in general. And we see this food, energy, water nexus and food production show up a number of places throughout global horizon scanning. We're going to have to feed the world going forward, and certainly aquaculture is growing fast. It creates many opportunities, many coastlines. And so the blue revolution, so to speak, as aquaculture has been called, it really permits tremendous opportunity. At the same time, if we have an intensification of aquaculture operations along coastlines, we have to be cognizant of the potential influence that may have on surrounding ecosystems and organisms that inhabit these locations. We also need to be cognizant of the quality of the aquatic systems in which they're actually growing fish or shellfish or plants. There's 239 at least species, if I'm remembering the number correctly, at least from FAO, that's been identified for aquaculture operations around the world, where perhaps up to 80% of the global sewage remains untreated each day. Thinking about different types of engineering science questions, this is all over the place. Marginal sources of drinking water from aquifers for eutrophic systems, really thinking about advancing sort of technological influences during resource recovery, and also fit for purpose applications to reduce risk to people. Think about, water reuse in particular shows up as well throughout the Global Horizon Scanning Project. We also see, as was mentioned, I do have an interest in harmful algal blooms and have been working in this space for a while, but again, this isn't Brian's question. This was something that came up in multiple regions around the world, because perhaps we shouldn't be surprised. We're seeing the development, particularly in inland surface waters for harmful algal blooms. Certainly this is, Canada is not an exception, as you know. This continues to create challenges with cyanobacteria and even some of the other more harmful algal bloom forming species that have really attributes that are similar to invasive species. Some years ago, I was thinking about this topic a bit with some colleagues, And we posed a simple question: hey, are these blooms actually becoming one of the biggest, water quality threats to people and aquatic ecosystems? And I think, we've settled on, in some places, in some cases, sometimes they actually already are. I will have to give a shout out to my Canadian colleagues, particularly in Saskatoon. The idea for this paper came about when I was honored to be a Fulbright candidate visiting research chair in water and the environment in Lethbridge, and was able to come over and give some talks, including in Southern Ontario, but also at the University of Saskatchewan. They had a talks on tap, scientific cafe type series, and basically that was the inspiration for this work. So shout out there. But we're working across different types of disciplines: ecology, toxicology, chemistry, public health, community outreach, as part of our Center for Oceans and Human Health, Climate Change Interactions. This is based at the University of South Carolina, and we had the harmful algal bloom part. Really fantastic, these oceans and human health centers in the United States. Of course, there's programs in a number of countries around the world, and thinking about how climate change is particularly, creating some of the challenges. They're so complex and multifaceted, but within the context of oceans and human health, they can be very palpable, especially as we think about, implications for future food supplies. For exposure science and analytical chemistry, environmental chemistry, number of questions, of course, and I'm just hitting some highlights. There was 149 questions across different topics, and we'll provide the citations now. You're, of course, welcome to contact me afterwards with questions or however we can engage. Clearly non-target and suspect screening types of approaches have really been exploding, and we see the opportunities. This is reflective certainly through the Global Horizon Scanning Project. And I think we're going to continue to need to see some of the accurate mass approaches. You only find what you're looking for, is what one of my mentors used to always say. There's also a common adage in public health and environmental protection. If you can measure it, you can manage it. I also think about the Rumsfeld quotes about the known knowns and the unknown unknowns. And yeah, so this is really pretty relevant, pretty timely, and exciting, quite frankly, as we see the science develop in those spaces. And we think about some of the types of contaminants that are getting lots of attention. This was a global perspective published in Letters last year by a group taking on, a high profile group of substances, certainly, there in Canada, PFAS, a big issue as well. And this group actually proposed, some rationale for trying to manage all the substances as a class. That flies in the face of approaches in some places, but certainly parts of Europe are looking at this right now, and with some activities that are expected to continue. We think about just taking that global perspective. Here's some work by Jalen Sims and Kevin Strosky. Kevin's actually a PhD student with us from Manitoba, really from Winnipeg in particular. But, if we think about all the PFAS that are out there, man, there's, thousands. But in fact, if we were to just look at, say, 24 common PFAS that are associated with some of the standard methods, you can see that, the concentrations of the substances in different media, in different locations, in different types of aquatic systems really vary. You can focus in on individual substances for which we already have guideline values. So think about source waters, right? Groundwater or for potable purposes and potable source waters. Of course, there's a lot of development right now with different types of guidelines, standards, and criteria for various PFAS around the world. Certainly a space that will continue. And this is where targeted and non-targeted analysis has been really critical. Think about just the implications for aquatic life. Here's a study that we've been done recently with our colleagues at US Geological Survey. Jeff Stevens taking the lead here. We've basically been working on the bioaccumulation of different PFAS in this freshwater mussel. And of course, you see some of the structural differences in uptake, and then also differences in the rate of elimination. The key is that as we're starting to translate what we're actually observing in the natural world to wildlife, to aquatic organisms, to bivalves that may be important for food, not all these substances are created equal, clearly, and we're going to have to think through that more comprehensively. I showed a picture of a freshwater mussel. Well, it turns out that, we see questions like this. Lots of concerns with our current environmental assessment approaches, maybe the existing tools in the framework, maybe not as much, but this is something that's a consistent theme across the global horizon scanning effort as it relates to concerns with environmental assessment. Thinking about sensitivity of regional species, it's getting a lot of attention. Certainly, there's work going on in Canada, but it seems that especially folks that are living sort of in the South, the global South, a lot of the standard model organisms that are employed have come from North America and Europe, and so how well do they actually reflect the potential implications for regionally important species? Here's the ananga from New Zealand, some of the work we've done with Nicole McRae and Sally Gaw and others down under. And so as it turns out, these fish can be really important from a cultural perspective, from a food standpoint, from a biodiversity priorities perspective, and also, quite frankly, can live in pretty extreme conditions. And so if we go back to, some of the biodiversity issues, of course, in North America, this is some work by Becca Burkett, again, in collaboration with our colleagues at USGS. Becca's a PhD student with the team and currently at EPA in DC, actually working on the PFAS topics. But, if we look at, say, two of these down the drain chemicals, sertraline's an antidepressant, it's a model weak base. And so the substance essentially doesn't really reach a steady state over a short time period of a few weeks, but then we would normally in a fish model have observed steady state, already observed just in 2 to 3 days with that compound. But then, of course, the substance is actually being depurated fairly predictably. Now, if we look at acetaminophen, which is a weak acid, we do see some steady state conditions that are actually, achieved there within about 100 hours. That's pretty similar to what we might see in a fish model. But then actually these freshwater mussels are not really depurating acetaminophen appreciably. And so that's going to lead to the body burden. And we need to think about these kinds of questions as it relates to especially species of concern. And so how do we think about the standard model issues, the organisms that may represent conservation goals? Questions like extrapolation of effects data across species using evolutionary conservation of biological pathways shows up as well in global horizon scanning. And so if we think about just, what we're learning as a field from this idea of comparative pharmacology, we'd always been looking to mammalian toxicology for mechanistic information. We had been even using medications as positive controls, and we recognized that we knew more about things like pharmaceuticals than really any other class of environmental contaminants. And of course, that really turned a light on in my head early on that we could learn a lot and generate essentially information comparatively across species. Now you're seeing incredible work that's been going on in different locations. Here's some of the work from Sweden by Lena Gunnarsson, Joachim Larsson's team. We also see some of the work that's been happening at EPA. If you're interested in this space, I'd encourage you to check out, if you're not familiar, SequaPass. It's really developed by Carly Lalone at the EPA lab in Duluth. But then also at EcoDrug, this is an industry partnership with some academics, Charles Tyler and AstraZeneca, have been really kind of focusing on some of these types of questions, again, building from an understanding of cross-species susceptibility to chemical pollutants. And of course, just I'll have to plug a little bit of Ted Valenti's work here, where you essentially see in a fish model a very similar types of what we would consider molecular initiation event responses to sertraline, an antidepressant, in a fish model in the fathead minnow here, as you might see in a mammal like a Sprague Dolly rat or in you or me after a few weeks of treatment with the antidepressant. And what we're also seeing then is that translates to behavioral changes. And so that what we're seeing in this slide is that control fish essentially are spending more time in shelter because of anxiety. When the lights are on, when the lights are off, they essentially are out exploring. However, once they're actually receiving internal doses of this particular antidepressant that are exceeding human therapeutic doses, their actually anxiety behavior is changing. Okay, and so they're not as cautious and certainly more in an exploratory role where they would normally be using that shelter. So what are the ecological implications of these types of efforts? A lot of work going on around the world. There's also work going on to try to design substances that are inherently less hazardous. This is big business. A lot of things going on in green chemistry. You may be familiar with green chemistry principle 4, focusing on the design of less hazardous chemicals, but maintaining functions. This is really hard, but there is a lot of low-hanging fruit. And man, we see sustainable molecular design, environmental quality, intersections, green chemistry principles all over global horizon scanning. So this is an opportunity for, to advance various types of more sustainable substitutions and alternatives, and then even promote de novo design of those less hazardous substances. So these are just some examples of the questions that we see that are coming around the world to be able to even interface risk assessment, life cycle analysis, risk benefit analysis in the design and identification of alternatives. And again, just some of the work that we've been doing as part of Modern, which is a network based at Yale with our colleagues there at the Yale Center for Green Chemistry and Green Engineering. If you're interested in the Global Horizon Scanning Project, I'd point you to some of the recent papers from Europe, North America, Latin America, Oceania, and more recently from Asia. I'd like to transition for the last few minutes and just mention some work that we've been doing to identify some priority research needs related to environmental health practice. We see these types of headlines in the news, it seems like all the time, right? Outbreaks, cyclones, Legionnaire's disease is on the rise in the United States, right? Harmful algal blooms causing challenges in Toledo. And we don't oftentimes think about the people that are working behind the scenes to protect the health of local communities. And we partnered with our Centers for Disease Control and Prevention here in the United States to really start looking at key challenges and opportunities for the environmental public health practitioners. Environmental health issues are profoundly local. These matter to local communities. In the United States, the second largest part of the public health workforce after nursing. And folks are working in food safety. They're working in many different places: water, air quality, healthy homes, emergency response, vector control, disaster preparedness. But the challenge is that oftentimes it's considered a silent or an invisible profession because, if something is going well, nothing makes it to the front page. And then when the foodborne illness or the contaminated water issue or the new vector disease burden comes through a community, then we're aware. But as it turns out in the US, an understanding of this workforce was surprisingly poorly understood. And in fact, the last actual examination of the environmental public health workforce in particular was done in the early 1960s. Yet what we see now is that our health delivery systems are oftentimes fractured among states, tribes, and territories. Yet we know if we can actually deliver the essential services of environmental public health, we can really protect and promote the health of local communities. And so UncoverEH, understanding needs, challenges, opportunities, vision, and emerging roles in environmental health, was an initiative from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, with the primary partnership being with the National Environmental Health Association, NEHA, which is really an outstanding practice-based association in the United States, but also has members from all over the world. And so a similar model was employed, where we essentially asked many people across the United States that are working in health departments, local, state, federal health departments, to try to understand what are the challenges they're facing now and in the future, and what are the resources they may need to be able to address those emerging challenges. One of the outputs from UncoverEH was an article in the American Journal of Public Health. There's also a special section that was specifically devoted to this topic. And yeah, I mean, when you get reviewer comments and editor comments that essentially say that reading your paper was depressing, I don't think it's great news, quite frankly, but at the same time, we've been able to identify some very important opportunities. And so this paper resulted from one workshop, which simply focused on what individuals need to do their job. Okay. And what's fascinating is if you look at this paper from 1942 in AJPH, we see common trends, actually very parallel similarities, where the local, what they would call sanitation practitioners back then, but the local work resulting from better coverage of previously recognized problems and also the appearance of new modern problems. That's what we see throughout UncoverEH. And there were 29 problem priority statements that were identified to try to support the work of environmental health professionals. So all of these papers and the information is available at the CDC project website. If you're interested in environmental health practice, I would encourage you to check it out. There's also another workshop output that really focus on challenges and research needs for US-based health departments. And so this is broken down not by, say, areas of particular need, but it was actually partitioned among common program areas that are being delivered, like water, wastewater, food safety, healthy homes, vectors, pests, and some emerging issues as just some examples. And so again, pretty diverse groups of questions, but is already starting to make a difference in the United States. So we see, for example, the CDC has already sent millions of dollars in grant funding to health departments based upon the outputs that came from UncoverEH. We see other impacts that are benefiting the practice, to recognizing that individuals working in environmental health are taking on many new roles. They tend to be the individuals in the health department that all the new stuff goes to in many cases. And the number of different types of program areas that the environmental health practitioner is engaging in the United States is surprising, quite frankly. And very, very rarely is someone working in just one space. Most of the time, they're spread quite thin. They're working across different types of topic areas. They have to be specialists in certain areas, but they actually have to be very effective generalists. Okay, they also tend to be the face of public health in the community, working with businesses, and also local citizens. And so, what we were not able to do is this was performed before COVID-19, but NEHA, National Environmental Health Association, has tried to assess how the COVID-19 pandemic has actually put pressure on a workshop, basically, or on a workforce like this. And what we see from UncoverEH is that the environmental health workforce tends to be overworked, understaffed, okay, and also getting close to retirement. And so I think if you're interested in the space, I would point you to a needs assessment sort of during COVID that was performed. There's a report at the NEHA website from around this time. It was October, if I remember correctly, of last year. Yeah. Really some challenges that we need to look at. So to wrap up here, there were some key recommendations: academic preparation. We just don't have enough people entering the workforce. For those that are in the workforce, oftentimes they're not trained in public health or in environmental health in particular. And so things like the registered environmental health specialist, my understanding is even some of the input from UncoverEH has been helping the credentialing bodies to kind of rethink the type of topics and diversity of the work that's going on by environmental health professionals in the United States. We also think we need strategic national training programs that actually need to be developed. And my understanding is some of this is actually moving on in the US. Non-traditional partnerships, you think about the urban, but also the peri-urban, the rural areas. Think about developing non-traditional partnerships can be very useful and I think critical to be able to advance the practice here. A joint leadership program, we think that there's opportunities to really restart. I know some years ago, well over a decade ago, I benefited from an Environmental Public Health Leadership Institute at CDC, and the National Environmental Health Association has recently started a new leadership program, I think at least in part in response to some of the findings from UncoverEH. Tremendous opportunities for translational science partnerships. In terms of working with testing, you have the best science in the world, but if you can't actually translate it into practice or promote essentially, decision-making at the local level, as we've seen through the COVID pandemic, maybe even more where I live than where you live, it can be a real challenge. Yeah, we think that there needs to be strategic research that's going on. As I mentioned, some of this has already been actioned and has been moving along. And then we also think that we need to be thinking about integration with existing programs within our research activities. In particular, the folks that are working in the practice in the local communities, they're tremendous partners for applied and translational research. If you're working in environment and health, I'd encourage you to think about engaging these colleagues, because they're the boots on the ground, so to speak, and they're really doing the work. So far, we're really seeing UncoverEH filling some important gaps. As I mentioned, we see that 96% of the EH professionals that we surveyed plan to retire in 5 years, yet only 6% of the students in public health are concentrating their studies in environmental health in schools and programs of public health in the United States. We now have a committee of deans, directors, and department chairs across a number of very large schools of public health in the United States, and we're collectively trying to revision what does environmental health training look like in the future. And so again, more information on UncoverEH is found at this website from CDC, and I hope it'll be useful to you. There were some key problem statements for decentralized wastewater in particular that were identified through UncoverEH. So these are things like on-site systems. Think about septic tanks or more advanced on-site wastewater treatment. And what we find is actually the local health departments, at least in the United States, have the responsibility for this water infrastructure. And, some pretty interesting topics come up. If you just look at some of the problem statements here for decentralized wastewater, what we realized there was an opportunity to think about this space more specifically. And what's going on right now is something called Now R Squared. And we're partnering with the National On-Site Wastewater Recycling Association, or NOWRA. And this project, again, is another horizon scanning or research needs effort, thinking about on-site wastewater recycling research. So we've completed the initial survey. It's being examined by a diverse committee of individuals from government, non-for-profit, academic, business sectors in the United States. We'll have an upcoming synthesis workshop working on what that looks like right now. And then next year, the output from the synthesis workshop will then be sent back out to initial survey populations and ask them to rank questions and some of the issues that are identified. So I've taken you on a little bit of a journey over the last few minutes. Thank you for your attention. Thank you to the colleagues there at Waterloo for the opportunity. I think what we have recognized is that when we think together, when we work together across disciplines, there's really tremendous opportunities. And so, yeah, I mentioned a little bit of the science that we're involved with here in our individual research program, but this activity is really, not about me. It's about we. It's about us thinking together. And some people call this the science of science, right? But the short of it is, as we look to the horizon, I encourage you to think about opportunities to partner with colleagues. Think about how COVID-19 has been stressing different types of systems. Think about the opportunities to translate your work and working with practitioners at the local level. We find that very gratifying, but we also find it an opportunity to make a difference to protect and promote public health and environmental quality. So again, thank you for the opportunity. I think we still have 10 or 15 minutes or so for questions. And Roy, I'll hand the mic back over to you or Nancy.
Thank you very much, Brian. It was an excellent presentation. We have 10, 15 minutes for questions. Please put your questions in the Q&A box. I don't see anyone posing a question yet. Please ask your questions in the Q&A. I can kick off the discussion, maybe Brian, with you. So this was a very comprehensive overview. I very much like the One Health approach that you are using, and I was wondering a little bit what your thoughts are about the need, perhaps, of rethinking our conceptual modeling approach to integrated risk assessments. There are different conceptual approaches, adverse outcome pathway, for example. And there is a lot of talk about integrated risk assessments, for example, in Europe through the European Chemicals Agency with their REACH legislation. What are your thoughts, and maybe even also your experiences with actually bringing these different disciplines together in such an integrated risk assessment procedure?
Well, Roy, I think there's a lot of value, a lot of merit. You're talking about in this one example of AOPs, and we think about integrated risk for human and ecosystems. Folks like Glenn Suter have been publishing on this topic, not just Glenn, but others for a number of years. And so then when we're thinking about, One Health or combined approaches for people, for ecosystems, I actually think in this comparative pharmacology and toxicology space is really an intellectual bridge to actually realize some of those goals. Because if we're thinking about pathways, if we're thinking about targets that are actually conserved across species, if those functions are conserved, it at least creates an opportunity to develop testable hypotheses. That we think about even the development of animal alternatives. In the United States, the US EPA is moving to eliminate mammalian testing for regulatory activities, and the goals that they have are pretty aggressive in terms of eliminating, say, mammals just in less than 15 years. And so then if you say, okay, well, a lot of that work is moving into cells, it's moving into things like the zebrafish model, other animal alternative models, we still have to be able to understand the value, the limitations, and the opportunities of the systems in which we're working. And so, yeah, we see the sort of the One Health, the integrated types of approaches that come out certainly through the Global Horizon Scanning Project. But I think this is where some of the comparative pharmacology and toxicology, when we think about chemical assessments, can be really valuable. Not just to identify things like molecular initiation events and tipping points, but then also to feed that information into computational chemistry and some of the sustainable design elements that we were describing. It's kind of an exciting time right now. And as we look forward over the next 10 years, I think you're going to see that space continue to accelerate. We need more computational chemists working with toxicologists, quite frankly, and molecular geneticists. I think it's just tremendous, really exciting.
Thank you. I think in the meantime, there are a number of questions in the Q&A. Nancy, have you had a chance to look at some of them?
Yeah, And I think that there's one set of questions that asks you to maybe expand on what you were just talking about, because they're acknowledging that often professors and researchers work independently on their large projects, as opposed to working truly interdisciplinary on interdisciplinary teams. And I think that that's what you were sort of getting at. Their question is, what are some tips on how to create, how to promote more integrative thinking around these solutions?
Look, this is kind of a tough deal, right? Especially in the age of COVID-19, and in some ways it's like, the last 18 months feel like it's just flown by, and other weeks, Roy, it feels like it's been a decade. And where are we, but you got to have a conversation, right? I think you have to be willing to look outside of your space. And that's a challenge, right? Because all of us are, we're all active in our own areas. We're all busy, and we're thinking about the due dates and the deliverables, and we're juggling multiple schedules. And that, that's the same for graduate students, postdocs, faculty members, folks working in government or business. So it's still challenging, but I do think that there's lots of merit to being able to just think outside of your essentially light post, right? So you've heard the analogy before, are we seeing outside the light post? And so this is just the analogy of you're standing under the light post at night, and you can't really see beyond what's being illuminated. So it does take effort, right? At the same time, there are programs, you guys are with a water institute, pretty cool, having some familiarity. I've reviewed proposals for you over the years. I'm not asking for more work, Roy. I'm just saying that, I'm familiar somewhat with some of the things you guys have done. Think about some of the grant programs there we've also reviewed for in Canada that's also promoted, stimulated work across disciplines, right? Across different types of universities, partnerships with the private sector, government researchers. And so I think we have to think about it as individuals, right? To really kind of sometimes step outside of our comfort zone, find partners, and sometimes it's just having a coffee or a pint, and hopefully we'll be able to have a pint with our colleagues there in Canada before too long.
Great, thanks. One other question from someone who you may have had a pint with in the past. Mark Servos is asking, so for fear of being more depressed, what do you see as the most pressing environmental issue that we might face in the next 10 years?
Yeah, well, it's tough, Mark, because we all have our pet preferences, right? And but I think if I go back to some of the horizon scanning topics, maybe what I was most surprised by was and this was universal, right? This was everywhere. The concern that people have with the existing risk assessment approaches, right? So we think about risk assessment, and maybe it wasn't so much the paradigm, but it was maybe the tools and how readily we're actually integrating sort of next generation science. I think about all the work that's going on with NAMs right now, right? This is really exciting, but at the same time, how do you integrate that into assessment and management frameworks? And so, from a practice standpoint, as it relates to our space, I think it's how do you translate, the best available science, the best available approaches into practice. I think that's always been the case, but I think what we're seeing is such an explosion, alternative models, molecular information, the non-target suspect screening, and so where along our assessment and sort of management decision-making continua, both prospective and retrospectively, can we integrate these advances more efficiently? So then in terms of problems, hey man, I have there's lots of things that are happening. I mean, obviously climate change is one of those just overarching challenges that tends to dwarf a lot of our individual topic areas. I do think that the influence of urbanization, specifically if we go outside of, say, where you live and where I live, you're going into the low and middle income countries. I think the chemical production, the consumption, the use, the lack of really infrastructure, sometimes even to track what's being made, how is it moving across borders, wastewater, treatment, other pollution prevention schemes. I think we're going to continue to see the non-communicable diseases rise. And I think we're going to increasingly appreciate the role that things like pollution play in those pretty heavy disease burdens around the world. I can go on this. I've got my pet interests, and that's where we'll have to have another pint, hopefully sooner than later, my friend, and solve the rest of the world's problems together.
Thank you so much, Bryan. There are no more questions. I propose we wrap it up here. We're 2 minutes to the hour. Bryan, thank you so much once again for your enlightening talk, the fantastic overview that you provided us with, the food for thought that you left us with. Thanks very much for sharing your knowledge and your understanding with us today. To those of you who've been listening in, thank you very much for participating in this first WaterTalk of the new term. We'll be back in a month's time on the 21st of October. We've got Megan Konar from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign with us then, from Civil and Environmental and Engineering. She's going to talk about water and food security. We look forward to welcome you to that talk in a month's time. Thank you all for participating. And Bryan, once again, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you very much. Warmest wishes to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye, everyone.